Private Homer Ford is lying under a dead man. He can't move, can't breathe too deep, can't make a sound. Boots crunch through the snow 6 feet away. A pistol shot, then another. Moving through the rows, he has no idea how long he's been here. The cold stopped hurting 20 minutes ago. What he knows, what he can feel through the frozen ground, is that the men with the boots are SS, and they are finishing anyone still breathing. 84 of his friends are dead in this field. And if the US Army catches the men who did this, they're going to give them a trial. Could you live with that? December 17th, 1944, Malmedy, Belgium. The fire didn't stop until the screaming did. Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, rolls through the Baugnez Crossroads just after 1,300 hours, 30 trucks, 140 men. Artillery observers, surveyors, support troops. No armor, no anti-tank weapons. Following a routing order that made sense when it was issued. Before the front moved and nobody told them. They don't know Kampfgruppe Peiper is less than a kilometer north, under a mile away. Moving fast, moving through anything in its path. The Panthers come around the bend. Some Americans run. Most don't make it 10 meters. Within minutes, over 100 men are standing in the road, disarmed, hands up. They're marched into a snow-covered field 200 meters, roughly 220 yards, south of the Crossroads, next to a cafe called the Café WWII. The main column keeps rolling west. Peiper doesn't stop. He leaves the prisoners with the units behind him. The Americans stand in that field, waiting. I want you to hold that moment. You've surrendered. Done everything right. You're cold and scared, but you're alive. The shooting feels like it might be over. 2 half-tracks reposition. Turrets swing toward the field. At 14:15 hours, someone gives an order. The machine guns open up, sustained fire. Men fall in rows. Some run. The gunners track them across the snow. Some drop and press themselves into the frozen mud and pull the dead down on top of them. When the shooting stops, the boots start. Single pistol shots moving through the field. Methodical, deliberate. This isn't chaos. This is policy. Homer Ford lies under a body for over an hour. Hears the boots, feels someone kick the man on top of him. Doesn't move, doesn't breathe deep. When the sounds fade, he crawls to the tree line. Finds survivors. They move through the dark forest toward American lines. Ford reaches those lines by nightfall. 84 men don't. To understand how we got to that field, you need to go back 24 hours. December 16th, a ridge above Lanzerath. 18 Americans from the 394th Infantry held off 500 German paratroopers for nearly a full day. 18 men, and they held. The man sitting behind those 18 Americans, watching his schedule fall apart, was Joachim Peiper, 30 years old, former adjutant to Himmler, Eastern Front veteran whose units had already left a documented trail of civilian massacres in the Soviet Union, decorated, intelligent, fluent in English, completely fixated on speed. His formation, the Kampfgruppe Peiper, was the spearhead of the entire Ardennes offensive. 4,800 men, 600 vehicles. Koenigsteiger heavy tanks carrying 88mm cannons that could kill a Sherman from 2 kilometers, over a mile away, before the Sherman crew even registered a target. His orders: punch through the American line, seize the Meuse bridges, capture Allied fuel depots. Don't stop. Speed is the mission. Everything else is secondary. Everything else. Those 18 Americans cost him 18 hours. By the time he cleared Lanzerath, the schedule was already broken. Fuel was running low. The roads were iced narrow, forcing hundreds of vehicles into single-file columns through forested ridges. He wasn't slowing down for anyone. That pressure, that compressed timeline, that absolute command to keep moving. is the context for what happened when his column hit Battery B at Baugnez. It doesn't explain 84 men shot with their hands up. But it explains what everything else is secondary sounds like inside a column that's been moving for 36 hours and is still 50 miles, 80 kilometers, from its objective. Word of the massacre spread through American lines before dawn, not through official channels. Soldier to soldier, foxhole to foxhole. The SS shot prisoners south of Malmedy, hands up, in a field. By December 18th, Schaef had sworn depositions. General Hodges at First Army ordered an investigation. In the middle of the largest German offensive since 1940, with divisions encircled and supply lines collapsing, the Army stood up a war crimes team and sent it to that field. Because if what happened at Baugnez disappeared into the fog of combat, it meant the fog of combat could cover anything. That was a precedent the Army refused to set. The massacre changed the fight immediately. German POW capture rates dropped in sectors where the story spread. The rules that were already fraying bent further. Malmedy didn't just kill 84 men. It changed the temperature of the entire battle. Peiper kept moving west, took Stavelot, came within 5 kilometers, just over 3 miles, of the fuel depots his offensive depended on. That close. Then the line stiffened. The 30th Infantry Division, elements of the 82nd Airborne. The fuel ran out. By Christmas Eve, Kampfgruppe Peiper was encircled near L'Église. Fewer than 800 men left of 4,800. His Königssteiger tanks, irreplaceable, were blown in place. He requested permission to withdraw. Denied. He withdrew anyway, on foot, Christmas Eve, through the forest, in the dark. He left his vehicles, he left his wounded. The bodies at Baugnez were still in the field. Graves registration units reached the Crossroads in mid-January. The cold had preserved everything. 84 bodies clustered in groups. Wounds consistent with close-range execution. Shell casings across the kill zone. The physical evidence matched survivor testimony in every detail. This was a crime scene. These men were documented once, in January 1945, by investigators in a frozen field. Most of their names haven't been spoken since. If you think they deserve to be remembered, hit like and subscribe. I share stories like this every week. Peiper was captured in June 1945. Calm, composed, already building his defense. 73 members of Kampfgruppe Peiper were tracked across POW camps and occupation zones and brought in. The trial opened May 16, 1946 at Dachau, the former concentration camp, now a war crimes tribunal. That location was not accidental. 6 weeks. Survivor testimony. Autopsies. Forensic photographs. 43 men who had been in that field, describing what they saw with the consistency that only comes from having actually lived it. Peiper's defense. He wasn't at Baugnez when the shooting started. True, he was already miles west. He called it battlefield chaos, confused troops, no clear order. The tribunal didn't accept it. July 16, 1946. All 73 defendants, guilty. 43 death sentences, including Peiper. He never hanged. Here's what matters most, and gets talked about least. The Army's own investigators broke the case they were building. Before trial, American interrogators used coercive methods on some defendants, mock trials, hooded interrogations in darkness, threats that were, in documented instances, more than implied. The forensic evidence was solid. The survivor testimony was solid. The case didn't need the coerced confessions. But because investigators had used those methods, the entire evidentiary record was now contaminated for anyone looking for a reason to question the verdicts. By 1948, plenty of people were looking. West Germany was now a necessary Cold War ally. The men in Landsberg prison were a diplomatic inconvenience. A Senate subcommittee, chaired by Joseph McCarthy, before Malmedy was the thing people knew him for, held hearings alleging systematic abuse during interrogations. Death sentences were commuted. Life sentences reduced. By 1951, not one of the 43 death sentences had been carried out. 0. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 43 death sentences for 84 men shot in a field with their hands up. The Army's own reviewers concluded the sentences couldn't stand. Not because the crime was in doubt, but because the Army's own investigators had broken the rules while documenting someone else breaking the rules. The institution that was supposed to deliver justice had poisoned the well it needed to drink from. That failure had consequences beyond the sentences. It became the lesson that reshaped how war crimes investigations were built afterward, why evidence collection protocols became rigid, why chain of custody mattered, why coerced confessions were explicitly excluded from later frameworks. The Army documented its own failure, which is more than most institutions manage. The legal principle that commanders are responsible for the actions of their men, whether they gave the order or simply failed to prevent it, survived the trial's collapse and went into the Geneva Conventions. The Hague operates on a framework that has Baugnez Crossroads in its foundation. That's the significance. Imperfect justice that still changed the rules. Cold comfort for Homer Ford. December 1956. 11 years after the massacre. Peiper walked out of Landsberg prison. 31 when those men died. 41 when he left. 30 years ahead of him. What happened to Homer Ford after the war? The official records don't answer that cleanly. He testified. He gave his deposition. He told the same story. The field, the boots, the weight of the body on top of him, the pistol shots moving through the rows, with the same details across years of interviews and follow-up questions. That consistency matters, not just legally. It matters because 40 years after the fact, the details hadn't changed. The cold that stopped hurting, the specific sound of boots in frozen snow, the instinct to go completely still when something kicked the man lying on top of him. You don't remember a story that clearly for 40 years unless you lived it. You remember things you can't forget. Did your grandfather serve in the Bulge? A lot of you carry family connections to the Ardennes, to 1st Army, to the units that fought in that sector that winter, maybe even to the 285th itself. If that's you, if this runs through your family history, tell me in the comments. I want to know who's listening. These stories matter most when they're personal. The survivors of Battery B gave testimony that remained consistent across decades. Most of them went home, carried it, got on with their lives the way men of that generation got on with things, not talking about it much, not processing it in the way we'd recognize now, just carrying it. Peiper, meanwhile, had built a quiet life. He worked for Porsche after his release, then moved into translating books, mostly military history, some of it about the SS. He settled in a small village called Treves in the Haute-Saône region of eastern France in the early 1970s. Used his own name, kept a low profile. It didn't hold. French veterans knew who he was. Former resistance members knew. His address was published in a French communist newspaper. He received threatening letters. He seems to have understood that something was coming and decided not to run from it. On the night of July 13th, 1976, Bastille Day Eve, someone came for Joachim Peiper. His house in Treves burned. Accelerant. Forced entry. Professionally done. When firefighters reached the ruins the following morning, they found his body inside, burned beyond recognition. Identified by dental records. Forensic evidence suggested he may have been shot before the fire started. French police investigated, made no arrests. Former resistance members were suspected. Far-left militant groups. Someone who had lost family along that road in December 1944, or at Stavelot, or Hansfeld, or Vareth, where 11 black American soldiers were tortured and executed after capture by units operating near Peiper's route. A massacre that received even less attention than Baugnez in the decades that followed. The investigation was closed, unsolved. Some fires don't need solving. I'll let you decide what you think about that. I'm not going to tell you how to feel about a man who commanded the unit that shot 84 prisoners dying in a burning house 32 years later. That's yours to work out. But I'll tell you this. The men who came for him that night in Travis understood something about justice that the Dachau Tribunal, for all its formal architecture, never quite delivered. Whether that makes what they did right is a different question. The Malmedy case left two things behind that most people don't connect to it. The first is legal. The principle established at Dachau that a commanding officer is responsible for the actions of his men, whether he gave the order directly or simply failed to prevent it, survived the procedural collapse of the trial itself, and went into the Geneva Conventions. It shaped how NATO forces trained on the laws of armed conflict. It influenced every subsequent war crimes tribunal, including Nuremberg's parallel proceedings. The legal framework that The Hague operates on today has Malmedy in its foundation. The second thing Malmedy left behind is harder to categorize. It left behind the question of what justice actually means when the system that's supposed to deliver it breaks under the weight of its own methods. The Army's investigators used coercive interrogation because they were angry and because they believed, correctly, that the men they were interrogating were guilty, and because in the immediate aftermath of the war, there wasn't a lot of institutional patience for procedural purity when the evidence was lying in rows in a frozen Belgian field. That's understandable. It's also exactly how you lose a case you should win. The Army learned that. The lesson cost more than it should have. The Baugnez Crossroads is still there, just off the N62 highway south of Malmedy. There's a memorial, 84 names in stone. In winter, when the snow comes down across the Ardennes, the field looks much the same as it did on December 17, 1944. Some of the survivors went back, years later, stood in that field, tried to explain to their families what happened there. Most of them couldn't find the words. Homer Ford couldn't explain it either. But his deposition is in the National Archives, public record, available to anyone who wants to find it. Every detail of what he saw and heard and felt that afternoon is documented and preserved, and has never been seriously contested. What he couldn't put in a deposition was what it meant to walk out of that field when 84 men didn't. What it meant to testify clearly, consistently for decades, and watch the man who commanded that column serve 11 years and walk away into a quiet life in France. What it meant to be Homer Ford, alive, while they were still in the ground. The record doesn't burn. The names are still on that stone. But Homer Ford deserved better than what the process gave him. So did the other 83.